Hey everyone, I'm Ellen Rogan, and welcome to Horse's Mouth Live. And we have a special show for you today. We had something else planned, and given the what's going on in the world right now, in the United States right now, I really felt that we needed to switch this up and have a different kind of conversation this week. And thinking about this, I've learned a lot in the last couple of weeks about the racial wealth gap, about what the stats are in our industry in terms of diversity. And honestly, I felt a little embarrassed that I didn't know this before and committed to really looking at things differently. Now, when I was thinking about switching up our show, I started to think to myself, okay, who can I bring on that could help with this? And my first thought was, oh, maybe there's a African American advisor I can bring on. And I was embarrassed to think like, okay, in my many years in financial services, I've met three. And I've met hundreds, if not thousands, of financial advisors. And then I immediately thought about Anne-Marie Schroeder, who is our guest today. I'm going to give you her background in just a minute, but Anne-Marie is a diversity and inclusion expert. And the last time we saw each other in person was in January, and we had a conversation about women in financial services, because that is something that in all the years I was an advisor, I never saw the percentages changed, and it's really important to me. And I think back about that conversation, and it was not even on my radar how little diversity there is, besides that there's so few women. So just leading up to this conversation today, I did some research. And as I know you know, because this has been publicized a lot, that close to somewhere between 75 to 85% of advisors are men, and the other portion are women or identify as women. And what I didn't know is that of the assets managed, the firms that manage these assets, 98.9% are managed by white men. So 1.1% are by women or minorities. So this is an area, our industry is an area that really needs to look at this now. Now, I know many firms are, but I think what's happening in the world, especially in the United States, is raising the awareness on this. And this is the conversation I want to have. So, Anne-Marie, welcome. And I want to give everyone a little bit about your background so they know what an expert you are in this area. Anne-Marie Schroeder spent more than 20 years in the field of diversity and inclusion as a facilitator, consultant, and an international speaker. She's fabulous at leading conversations that are very comfortable and I don't mean comfortable, open to all different viewpoints and meeting people where they're at and wanting to educate. It's not always a comfortable conversation for us to have. She's an expert in diversity and inclusion. She has her master's in bias awareness. She assists in the creation of healthy workplace communities through her signature methodology and inclusive leadership program. Organizations turn to Anne-Marie when they're looking to build environments where people can learn and be supported, seen, heard, and valued. She delivers presentations. She's a fabulous speaker. And really looking to inspire people to see more, raise awareness about the importance of inclusion. So welcome, Anne-Marie. I'm really, really honored, and thank you for switching your schedule around to be here with us on such short notice.
Thank you, Ellen, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to talk about this important topic.
So let's just start by briefly sharing with the audience how you got into this work and why it's interesting to you.
Oh, wow. Well, the brief version of that is I used to be an elementary school teacher. When I started teaching elementary school, I took a course called the Inclusive Classroom and learned about all the isms. And, I was in my mid-20s. I knew about racism because I'm a person of color. I knew about sexism because I'm female, but I didn't really have an understanding of a lot of the other isms. And so that sort of blew my mind. And I committed to creating a classroom where my students felt seen and heard and valued and, could could be all of who they are. And then I left teaching 5 years after that. Um, I loved parts of it. I didn't love parts of it. And I started my own business in 2004. So as a teacher, I did this kind of facilitation for teachers. The school board I was in was very progressive at the time. And now I'm sort of teaching adults. So,
Mm.
so it's
Yeah.
personal for me and professional because of how I move through the world and who I am, right?
And there's a lot to teach now. I've been really committing a lot of time in the last few weeks to learning more because I feel like I have so much to learn with the
Mm.
help of really our two adult children who are, I think, have made it their mission to make sure my husband and I are as educated as we should be or could be. Maybe not as educated, but getting more and more. And one of the videos that I realized you had recommended, but when I saw you in January, I think, but I didn't actually watch again till my son recommended it, which is on Netflix in the Explained series about the racial wealth gap.
Mm.
And my eyes were just so open to, wow, like how did this happen? And just getting so much more information. For those of you out there, it's actually on Netflix, I mean, on YouTube now, so you don't even have to be a
Mm.
Netflix subscriber. It's 16 minutes, and I learned so much about what's happening in that area. And I'd like to start our discussion with this discussion of systemic racism. What does that mean? Income, wealth, because it factors into our whole economy, but certainly the profession of financial advisors.
Absolutely. And it's a huge topic. So we'll do what we can in the time that we have to raise awareness. I think the most important thing to realize is that the wealth gap and the other gaps that we see in terms of income and whatnot are a result of centuries of systemic racism that value people less when they have darker skin. And the darker your skin, the less value you have. And so what that does over time is it keeps people in very entry-level jobs. It impacts education because we have lower expectations, and then those lower expectations translates into dropout or push out, as we call it. Kids that just choose not to stay in school because of the experiences they have of not being seen, not being heard, not being taken seriously. Teachers thinking that they're not smart, teachers thinking that they shouldn't bother to apply to college or university, and that still happens today based on skin color. And so what then happens is you have a domino effect, right? If I don't graduate from high school, I don't go to post-secondary. So that limits the types of jobs I can get in some ways, right? There are different paths. Then there's less representation in post-secondary. So we're not hearing diverse voices. We're not hearing voices of people of color, of African Americans, of people who are Black. Then there's less people of color and African Americans in faculty in those institutions. So we're not bringing that perspective into curriculum. So what happens then? We have less people in post-secondary, possibly. We have less visible diversity in professions, certain professions, which then creates a spiral. We don't see them, we don't expect to see them. So then we have lower expectations of what somebody can do. Research also shows that having a college education doesn't really impact one's income as much when one is a visible minority. So you could have a college degree and still be making less or still not be getting that job, the job that you were trained to do because of unconscious bias, low expectations, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a vicious cycle. And yeah, we'll just end there for
You
now.
know, most of the people I know would not think that they're racist or they have unconscious bias. You know, they are good people. They want to do the right thing. Can you give us some examples of how unconscious bias shows up for people?
Absolutely. And it's called unconscious bias because we're not conscious of it. And I like to remind people that we're all swimming in the same soup, right? Unconscious bias is unconscious because it's information that we receive about groups of people that we're all swimming in. It's like being steeped in tea, like a tea bag, right? So the minute we're born, we're bombarded with messages about who we are and who other people are. And for some people that works in our favor. right? If we have a middle or upper class income, if we have white skin or the lighter skin that we have, if we're male, all the dominant groups. And for non-dominant groups, people of color, women, LGBTQ2S plus communities, uh, a lot of the messages are negative. And so there's a negative impact of unconscious bias. How it manifests itself is in things like the expectations we have of people. So you might have a project coming on at work, and you're like, who can I talk to about this, or I have an issue, or who can I bring onto this project? And we're more likely to think of certain individuals that we have been taught to believe are responsible, reliable, professional, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we tend to see in diversity and inclusion work is unconscious bias favors dominant identities and then works against non-dominant identities, the marginalized identities.
And what are some things that someone, I think this is a good segue into microaggressions, or things that people don't realize we're saying that have an impact, and we don't mean any harm by it, but can have a negative impact when we're speaking with someone of color.
Right. So microaggressions often play into stereotypes that we have. So, of course, so-and-so is late, right? Or, no, don't show it to them. They'll never get it done. Or, are you sure you want that person to be on your team? Things like that. How we see people as aggressive, if they might be just assertive. And I think women have had a long history of that kind of conversation. So we might get called certain names because people think that, how we're presenting is not just being assertive and sharing a particular point of view that we feel strongly about, but is in actual fact, seen as something else. So using that kind of language, dismissing people just because of who they are examples of microaggressions.
I live in a suburb of Chicago, and it's a lovely suburb, predominantly white, that, it's, I don't know what the economic status is, but, it's a suburb where people there, I think, would say that they're more liberal and open. And there was a protest, a march on Sunday, and then a rally in the park, and they had people speaking who they had Black people and some other people of other. There was an indigenous person. They were sharing their experience of living in our town in Highland Park. And I think that was the most eye-opening thing. There was a woman who grew up in our town and was a shop owner, and they were talking about the police. And first of all, I had no idea that there was racial profiling in our town, that she said, I am scared to death of the police in our town. And as a white person, I had no experience of that personally. And in terms of microaggression, she owns a store, and she'll say, people come in and they'll talk to me and they'll say things like, what are you? And she looks at them like, what are you? I'm a human. Like, it was just a question that, even a question like that is awful. But people don't realize that when we say things like that, we are diminishing someone or hurting them.
Absolutely. And they're not called micro because they hurt less, right? They're called micro because, in my opinion, I'm sure there's a definition that we could reference, but sometimes they're easily pushed aside as, oh, I didn't mean it. You're being too sensitive. Come on, that was a joke. And we don't take it. People who are on the giving end of a microaggression don't take it seriously because they don't recognize the impact of those comments and the place those comments are coming from. And here's the critical piece: the place that those comments are coming from are from a place of, that less value, right? The darker you are, the less value you have. And because we are swimming in that, we say things like that without realizing that that's the message that's playing in our mind and that's coming out of our mouth at the same time as, like, what are you? Like, what, we think it's just a question and you're being too sensitive, but these are huge. They're hugely impactful. And as marginalized communities, we get them daily, multiple times a day, right? So there's a cumulative impact.
Yeah, will you share the, I think you called it the color scale,
The color
that you
ladder.
had shared the color ladder when you shared it when I heard you speak in January, and then again we were on a call yesterday with a group that we're in, because that was something I hadn't heard of before, and I actually shared it with my son last night, who is doing a job. He's really taking a deep dive in educating himself, and it was new to him as well.
Mhm. So the color ladder references the fact that we are taught to believe in North America and in many parts around the world, and you can go back in history, it's the impetus for colonization, that the lighter your skin, the more value you have, and the darker your skin, the less value you have. But it's a ladder because our skins are in different tones, right? So white is at the top of this belief system, and then the darker your skin, the less value you have. And so how that manifests itself is in this belief in the superiority of people with white skin and that way of seeing the world and that way of experiencing the world.
So I started out our conversation with talking about some of the stats in the financial services industry. And I know many of the firms are wanting to change this. They have diversity and inclusion programs. Um, and,
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about how that might change. Or, one of the things that I've mentioned to you is I'll hear people say, yeah, but there's just no one to hire. Like, I would love to hire someone of color. I would love to hire more women, but they're just not out there. So let's
Mm-hmm.
have a conversation about that, like what the reality is and what can be done to try to make this situation more diverse and equitable.
Right, that's a great question. So there's a couple of ways to look at this. First of all, I like to remind people that it's although we call it diversity and inclusion, the inclusion has to come first. And often what I see with clients is that they want to hire, they want to focus on hiring and create more representation, but they haven't examined their environment. So what happens is we bring in diversity, and then the people that we're bringing in are not having a pleasant experience in that environment for some of the reasons we've just mentioned, right? The microaggression, the unconscious bias, the unconscious belief in the color ladder, even without realizing it. So what we need to do is focus on inclusion first. Start talking about what our environment needs, what we want it to feel like. Find out from the people who are already here how they feel and what we can do to make it more inclusive, how to build a greater sense of community, how to increase engagement, all of the things, all those yummy conversations, right? Once we're starting to have those conversations and there's traction and we're looking at our environment, we're making changes both in policy and in practice, then we can start to expand who we want to bring in, right? To be more representative of the populations we serve. Here's the the thing that you mentioned, right? We can't find them. We can't find women, we can't find visible minorities. We tend to look at our networks first when we're looking to
Mhm.
hire. And so if your organization is not representative, the networks chances are not representative because we lean into networks and people who we think we have something in common with or actually do have something in common with, and skin color is very visible. Right? So it's one of the first things that we notice. And human beings like to be with people that are like us. That's just how we roll. So we need to be more conscious of where we are recruiting, where we're
Mhm.
getting our messages out, who we are tapping on the shoulder to say, do you know someone? Right? And it's not about quotas, right? It's about really expanding who we are, where we're looking, how we're asking, and then also being aware of the interview process. If you think about systemic racism and systemic anti-Black racism over centuries, and the ripple effects that we talked about earlier, education, profession, representation, and that cyclical nature, we want to make sure that when we look at a resume, we're not looking at things that unconsciously we're filtering out at the get-go, right? So we talk a lot about, we used to call it blind hiring. I'm sure there's a better way to say that now that's not focusing on sight. But sometimes postal codes, right? We look at a postal code or a community, we're like, I don't know if I want to hire somebody from there. And it's not even a conscious conversation that we're having. Or we look at the school, right? So these are things that in the hiring process we also need to be aware of. Who's doing the hiring? Who's on your panel? Making sure that your questions and the follow-up questions that you're asking really allow somebody to show up in that interview and present themselves in a way that you know would generate interest from your interview team. So there's many different levels of the conversation around diversity and inclusion. There's an internal piece, and then there's an external piece. And as you bring more diversity into your organization, the conversation about inclusion has to continue to evolve. Because as soon as you have more diversity and different representation, there's going to be different things that people need, different realities that they're facing. And we have to be open to hearing about those and making the changes so that the environment becomes safer and continues to be inclusive, and we can really support people in their productivity, engagement, etc.
Yeah, so important. And you started that saying that that our team looks like the population we serve. And I've thought about that a lot in financial services with women, but I'm embarrassed that when I think back about when I had my advisory firm, which was for more than 25 years, in all those years, and all the people that I've worked with, I had one African American woman client for a few years.
Mm.
And I don't believe that was unusual. I'm not saying it's good, but I think for us to just be looking at, like, who are you serving, and how could you serve a different community, or how can you have your team look more diverse? And so that was really something that I don't feel good about when I think back about it, but I'm actually feeling worse that I hadn't noticed it until
Mm.
now.
I
And
think not noticing is very common. So, like give yourself a break. And now you've noticed, so now, right? You'll see
yeah,
things
well,
differently.
I've had a
The
couple of
point.
weeks of really noticing a lot of what I didn't know. And
Yeah.
I don't want to make this about me, that I'm like embarrassed or ashamed that there was things I didn't know, because I'm learning now. Um, but yeah, there was a lot to learn about. We also, some of the ways we're getting educated besides reading, we just watched 13th, the documentary on Netflix
Mhm.
about the 13th Amendment. And I don't know if you've seen it,
I
because
haven't seen that one.
it's not your country, right?
Because it's not my
It's your
country, but that's
continent.
okay. Still good to know. Yeah.
Um, really, really interesting. And yeah, so there's a lot of ways to just be learning now.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I add something about the representation piece?
love that.
So, because we gravitate towards people that we have something in common with, right? When we think about diversifying a practice, a financial firm, um, how amazing is it that somebody can walk into your organization, your company, and see financial advisors of all different diversities, all different identities, and find someone that looks like them, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's gender, whether it's sexual orientation we can't see, but whatever the identity is, whether it's skin color, there's something powerful about that, because immediately we're drawn to that sameness. And what we're thinking is, oh, that person's going to get me. May not be
Mm-hmm.
true, but that's our right. That's our inclination. So when we create environments where we can have that diversity, we are able to serve diverse communities better, because the people that we're working with get it, right? And get different communities. And ideally, in an inclusive environment, we're going to share that information and share that knowledge. So it doesn't have to be because I'm an advisor of color that all my clients are people of color, or African American or Black, right? It's not about that, but we can share that information and help people to be more aware,
Mm-hmm.
understand, educate themselves, so that we can ask powerful questions to be able to connect with the people we're serving. And some of those powerful questions for African Americans, people who are Black, people of color, is knowing the history and the impact on intergenerational wealth, the wealth gap, opportunity, barriers that are faced, et cetera, et cetera. We imagine if your financial advisor got that, right? And we
Yeah.
do. When we share identities, we're able to make that connection.
And, on the other side, in terms of recruiting, I'm on one of my consulting clients is a bank, and I run their women's advisory board. And we have a newer member. In the first meeting she was at, she looked around the table and she's like, they're all older white women. Like, what is with this? and how many women are on the board of directors of your bank? And, and she was not okay, nor should she have been with that. And we're working to change it. But I think that, people younger than the average financial advisor age will look at a firm and not be okay if there isn't diversity there in terms of recruiting or having a plan. It's not only, of course, the right thing to do and to serve more people, but you have to be just like you have to have a some kind of social good that you're doing. Younger people don't want to work for a firm that's not doing anything but serving the shareholders or serving the top executives. So
Right.
it's yeah, and I think some of this again is I'm grateful when people bring things like this to my attention. And again, I'm embarrassed I didn't know it, but I keep thinking of this Maya Angelou quote: "When you know better, you do better." And that's where I'm trying to sit right now. When I know better, I do better.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
we just have a couple minutes left. We have hours more of conversation that I want to have with you. But for this conversation, we only have a couple minutes left. Are there resources or places that you would recommend that viewers and listeners could go to learn more or increase their ability to be create more diversity and inclusion in their companies, or just have awareness in their own lives?
Mm. So many places. Well, one thing I want to offer to folks is I have a newsletter that comes out every week. So that's one way to get D&I on your radar. And there's always a challenge, a little weekly challenge, because we need to train the muscle, right? Of what we're seeing, what we're not seeing. There's so many places. I'm in Canada, so I'm a little bit limited by, what's on my radar in terms of country. But I know that, let me think. There's the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion is doing some really powerful work. If you Google, inequity, diversity, and inclusion, there's so many amazing people doing this work. The Learners Group in the United States is one. US Squared in the United States is another. They do amazing work around D&I for organizations. I bet you there's resources on their websites that you could find. As you mentioned,
What
there's a
about
couple of
giving us
shows.
the challenge? What about, you said that each week there's some challenge or something someone can do. Is there one you can give
Yeah.
out to us now?
Well, the challenge this week that's coming out tomorrow is just to look at what's happening from a systemic place. Imagine the things that we're missing that are systemic, that aren't just individual one-on-one experiences, individual interactions, but how does the system support that? So we've seen a lot of protests and riots in the United States. We're having protests up here in Canada as well in response to what's happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd. And so being an ally means not just speaking up and stepping forward around injustice and marginalization, but being aware of the system that we're in. So it's like looking at something in two ways: the picture that we see and then what's behind it, what's supporting that. And that is a crucial awareness for folks who want to step into really changing the world, actually, right? When we wrap our heads around systemic racism and wanting to change that, so much will change.
Great. Thank you, Anne-Marie. So if people want to get on your newsletter list or learn more about the services, the consulting you do, the speaking that you do, where should they go?
They should go to my website, annemarieshrouder.com, and you'll see a little box there to say, sign up for the newsletter. It comes out every Wednesday. It's a small little blurb with an action item. And I think it's a really good way to start conversations, which we need more of, right? The more we talk, the more we can learn from each other, the better.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful to know you and that you could change your schedule around to be here with us for this important conversation. So thank you. And thank you for all of you who are watching this or listening to this program. I'm really grateful for you to be part of this important conversation. Again, my name is Ellen Rogan. You can learn more about me and the resources that I have at ellenrogin.com. That's ELLENROGIN.com. And if you go to ellenrogan.com horse's mouth. There's some additional resources there that are free for, and they're really helpful for financial advisors. So thank you. And, I usually, and I will today, end my conversations with you saying, how big of a positive impact are you willing to make? And it takes on a different meaning right now. So